On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the Pacific sky over Pearl Harbor cracked open with fire. Japan's surprise attack hurled battleships into the seafloor, turned steel into sinking coffins, and left thousands of Americans dead before the country had even understood it was at war. By sunrise the next day, the United States responded with a declaration that would change the fate of the 20th century. History would remember this moment not just as an ambush, but as a brutal demonstration of what happens when a rival misjudges the resolve of a nation built for scale. Admiral Yamamoto is said to have whispered a warning afterward. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually spoke the sentence is a matter scholars still debate, but the truth inside it is undeniable. What followed was the single greatest mobilization of industrial power the world has ever recorded. Overnight, the United States redirected its factories, its labor force, and its scientific community toward one singular purpose: victory. The transformation was staggering. In a span so brief, it still seems unreal. America produced nearly 100,000 tanks, 200,000 artillery pieces, and more than 300,000 aircraft. And that was only part of the output. 2/3 of all Allied military equipment came from American factories. Steel, rubber, aluminum, engines, fuel, it poured out in such volume that Axis planners, who once believed they could outrun American capacity, eventually understood they were fighting not just soldiers, but physics. A country that could build faster than its enemies could destroy. America proved not only that it would fight, but that it could outproduce every adversary on Earth. It operated like a command economy temporarily, ruthlessly. But then after victory, it dismantled the machinery of emergency control and returned to the messy, chaotic promise of a free society. And what did we do with that hard-earned freedom? We drifted, we celebrated, we globalized. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, we fell asleep again. The world changed while we were dreaming. We believed our dominance was a birthright rather than a discipline. And now, for the first time since the 1930s, the United States finds itself no longer the default industrial superpower. If you measure by output, China today resembles the America of World War II far more than America resembles itself. They are now the world's manufacturing center, producing more than any other nation alive. And because their political system allows orders to cascade from the top without interruption or dissent, they move with a speed the United States can only envy. But speed comes with its own shadows. China is not a democracy. It is a centralized authority with little tolerance for disorder. That fact hangs in the air like an unsaid threat as both nations slide into one of the oldest, most dangerous arrangements in human geopolitics, a declining power confronting a rising one. Historians call it Thucydides' trap. 16 times throughout recorded history, when one empire rose as another stood in its way, war followed in 12 of those cases. The details shift, but the mechanism is always the same. Each side becomes willing to do almost anything to secure advantage. So the question, uncomfortable as it sounds, presses forward. What exactly will the United States do to avoid losing the century? Will we drift further into the habits of an authoritarian system, believing we can borrow the efficiency of central control without its costs? We have done it before. Temporary wartime measures, emergency boards, centralized directives that solved the crisis and then dissolved. But today, the line between temporary and permanent is blurring. Right now, the United States government is no longer simply nudging industries with incentives. It is buying stakes in them. That means political priorities, not competitive excellence, could soon determine which companies rise and which collapse. A shift like that reverberates far beyond boardrooms. When the state picks winners, it is also choosing which investors prosper and which portfolios quietly bleed out. So here is the dilemma we must confront. Should America, in order to compete with China, begin adopting elements of China's command-style playbook? And if we do, does the free market as we know it survive? Or does it become something quieter, blunter, and more obedient? There is no easy answer. And the danger lies in believing one exists. This journey requires a slow descent into the machinery beneath the headlines, the incentives, the history, the power structures that pull nations toward control in moments of fear. That is why we will move step by step. What you hear at the end will not make sense unless you understand what is unfolding underneath your feet right now. So consider this your warning. This story does not go down smooth. It goes down straight, no chaser. As of 2023, China accounts for nearly 30% of all global manufacturing value added more than the next 4 countries combined, including the United States. Their steel output is a tidal wave, 76 million metric tons in a single December, while America produced only 6.7. In shipbuilding, the numbers are even more humiliating. China controls more than half of all commercial production. America controls 1/10 of 1%. A rounding error, a national liability disguised as a statistic. During the global pandemic, the consequences of that imbalance became painfully visible. Masks, pharmaceuticals, electronic components, even the rare earth minerals that power every drone, every phone, and every electric vehicle all leaned on a supply chain with China at its center. 70% of those minerals come from Chinese soil or Chinese processing plants. In a geopolitical foot race, China is not running beside us. It is sprinting far ahead while we argue over the rule book. The truth is simple. China plans. America debates. One system is unified by command. The other is paralyzed by its own political theater. But command economies come with a price. The same machinery that can build a bridge in a month can bury a country in error just as quickly. When a centralized authority is wrong, everyone is wrong together. Mao's Great Leap Forward remains one of history's clearest warnings, 45 million dead because a single man could not be contradicted. Today, under Xi Jinping, the lesson echoes in modern form. Ghost cities, suppressed dissent, the disappearance of entrepreneurs who dared to question the party line. America's founders understood this peril. They built a nation on the belief that freedom, messy, unpredictable, fractious freedom, was the only force strong enough to resist the gravity of tyranny. But freedom, too, has trade-offs. And now, after decades of drift, America must choose which trade-offs it is willing to accept. We can list endless ways China has outmaneuvered the United States in recent decades, and none of them point to a nation that still resembles the America of World War II. Back then, we were a country capable of overwhelming any rival with production, discipline, and national unity. Today, we are a financialized giant with soft edges, a nation that tries to solve geopolitical problems with sanctions, tariffs, and strongly worded press releases. Those tactics have not stopped post-Soviet Russia, let alone the economic juggernaut China has become. And if we are being honest with ourselves, the erosion began long before China emerged. Somewhere along the way, America quietly abandoned the principles of a truly free market. What we have today is something like a command economy in disguise, a system tangled by regulations dense enough to choke innovation, political donations large enough to capture entire agencies, and a revolving door between government and industry that turns oversight into protection. In the past year, the United States government has gone beyond incentivizing private companies. It has started buying ownership stakes in them, companies like Intel, MP Materials, and U.S. Steel. Historically, moments like this came with an exit plan, a commitment to withdraw once the emergency passed. Today, there is no clear off-ramp. Treasury and defense now stand not just beside American industry, but inside it, blurring the line between referee and player. Economists warned for decades that when governments use capital to guide sectors, distort markets, and tilt the playing field, the very foundation of competitive capitalism begins to warp. But now, after watching China accelerate its rise, America appears openly seduced by the same model it once condemned. Over the past 40 years, China's GDP per capita exploded from $180 to more than $12,500. Nearly 800 million people escaped extreme poverty, the single largest poverty reduction ever recorded. While American wages stagnated and life expectancy slid backward from deaths of despair, China's life expectancy jumped from 66 years to 78, a 12-year leap in one generation. It is not hard to see why many Americans look at those numbers and feel envy or panic. But here lies the danger. Copying China means misunderstanding what actually worked for China. Because the miracle did not begin with Xi Jinping. It began the moment Deng Xiaoping took power after Mao's death. Deng witnessed firsthand the ruin created by central planning mass famine, mass death, mass delusion, and then looked across the ocean at the United States, a country fueled by markets, competition, and decentralized decision-making. And he did the unthinkable for a communist revolutionary. He borrowed from capitalism. Beginning in 1978, Deng opened China's economic gates. Private enterprise was permitted. Foreign investment was welcomed. Americans were invited to teach them the mechanics of venture capital, banking, industrial organization. China did not invent the model that lifted hundreds of millions into the middle class. They copied ours and then executed it ruthlessly. But Deng's reforms came wrapped in chains. The Communist Party never surrendered political control. Credit, land, licensing, and law remained tightly held. Markets were permitted to flourish until they threatened the hierarchy. Growth was allowed to accelerate, but never independence. By the time Xi Jinping assumed power, China was wealthier than any communist leader before him could have imagined. Xi, unlike Deng, studied not the American miracle but the Soviet collapse. He concluded that economic freedom, once unleashed too far, could weaken political authority, so he set out to prevent that fate. Xi's anti-corruption campaign became a purge in slow motion, hundreds of thousands of officials removed, disciplined, or disappeared. Regulatory storm clouds rolled into every successful private company. Party representatives were embedded inside boardrooms. Compliance became survival. Loyalty became currency. When Jack Ma, China's most famous entrepreneur, criticized regulators in a public forum, the response was immediate and chilling. Ant Group's $37 billion initial public offering, the largest the world had ever seen, was halted overnight. Jack Ma vanished from public life and reappeared only after months of re-education. The message was unmistakable. In China, you may become rich, but you may not become powerful. While China soared, it also constructed bubbles of breathtaking scale. Local governments relied on land sales. Developers gorged on cheap credit. Skyscrapers rose in cities with no residents, monuments to a future that existed only on spreadsheets. When the credit tightened and buyers evaporated, the illusion cracked. The collapse of Evergrande in 2021, with $300 billion in liabilities, revealed the fragility beneath the spectacle. Confidence evaporated, and with it, the growth model that had carried China for decades. Underneath all of this progress was a darker truth. The same machinery that could create prosperity could also commit profound injustice. In the region of Xinjiang, mass surveillance, re-education camps, and forced labor turned minority populations into political hostages. China's rise, so dazzling from a distance, carried a moral cost paid in silence. This is the truth nations forget when they envy authoritarian efficiency. When you grant the state the power to command, you also grant it the power to crush. Disagreement becomes defiance. Defiance becomes danger. And danger is answered not with persuasion, but with force. When America looks at China and sees only the speed, the scale, the order, every alarm bell in the human story begins to ring. Because if we choose to imitate China, we must accept the full sequence, not just the parts that look convenient. Step 1. Concentrate political power. Step 2. Embed the government inside private industry. Step 3. Generate explosive growth by picking national champions. Step 4. Silence anything or anyone that threatens the structure. What emerges is a hybrid creature markets operating inside an authoritarian skeleton. And yes, it works until it does not. But before we can decide whether to embrace or reject that path, we must confront something far more uncomfortable. China is not the only nation with this pattern in its past. America, too, has moments when the free market bent under the weight of necessity. The question is whether those moments were exceptions or early warnings. In 1942, as World War II intensified, the United States crossed a threshold it seldom acknowledges today. To match the urgency of global conflict, Washington created the War Production Board, a centralized authority with the power to tell private companies exactly what to build. Factories that once made cars now produce tanks. Assembly lines built bombers instead of Buicks. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation issued more than $35 billion in direct loans to construct refineries, synthetic rubber plants, and shipyards. It was a temporary command economy layered on top of a free society, a paradox that worked only because the threat was existential and the end date was clear. What many Americans forget is that this was not the last time the United States blurred the line between capitalism and central planning. Throughout the Cold War, federal money poured into research and development at a scale no private investor could match. In 1964, the Pentagon's Advanced Research Projects Agency wired universities and defense labs together, creating the prototype that would eventually become the Internet. In the 1980s, when Japan threatened American semiconductor dominance, Washington formed a publicly funded consortium called Sematech, a government-backed alliance of chipmakers forged by the Department of Defense. After the attacks of September 11th, federal funding once again stepped into the void. DARPA, In-Q-Tel, and the Department of Energy's loan programs seeded the technologies behind Google Earth, Palantir, and even the first Tesla manufacturing facility. Despite the mythology of American entrepreneurship, some of our most iconic innovations were born from strategic, targeted government investment. And yet these were exceptions, not a philosophy. They were tools, not a worldview. The original design of America did not imagine a government that would shape markets as a matter of habit. But by the 21st century, the habit had formed. The CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act marked a new frontier. Hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies, equity stakes, and tax credits intended to micromanage everything from battery plants to semiconductor fabs. What once existed only in wartime now appears in peacetime. What once required crisis now requires only political consensus. The uncomfortable truth is this: the United States abandoned pure capitalism decades ago. The moment the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, a year that should live in economic infamy, the state gained the ability to print money, manipulate interest rates, and steer credit flows. When you can control the price of money, you can control everything that depends on it. And everything depends on it. The founders feared this exact outcome. Alexander Hamilton argued for a national bank solely to restore financial stability after the Revolution, not to guide industry, not to pick winners. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposed even that. Jefferson warned that banks were more dangerous than standing armies. Madison cautioned that concentrated credit power would enslave future generations under monopolies of paper. Their compromise, strict limits, and a 20-year charter. When Congress attempted to renew that charter in 1811, Jefferson's allies killed it. The message was clear. America would be a nation of competing enterprises, not a command economy disguised in powdered wigs. For nearly 100 years, that vision held. The federal government remained small. The dollar was backed by gold. Markets plunged, soared, collapsed, and rebuilt with ferocious autonomy. Boom. Bust. Rebirth. Chaos was not the enemy, it was the engine, forging the richest industrial society the world had ever seen. Railroads, oil empires, telegraphs, and giants of steel emerged from a battlefield of competition where no one was protected from failure. Then the grip tightened. The Federal Reserve Act in 1913, the income tax also 1913, the New Deal, which turned crisis management into permanent bureaucracy, wage controls, price codes, agencies that dictated how industries should compete or whether they could compete at all. The National Industrial Recovery Act, born in 1933, allowed entire sectors to form government-approved cartels that set prices, wages, hours, and production quotas. 500 such codes were written, covering everything from steel to dry cleaning. They carried the force of law until the Supreme Court struck them down in 1935. But the architecture of intervention remained. In 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window, severing the dollar from tangible value and ending fiscal restraint. From that moment forward, money became an instrument of politics, not production. Inflation was no longer a monster to fear, but a tool to manage. Debt was no longer a burden, but a lever. And the cost of that shift is still unfolding across the lives of young Americans who now cannot afford the homes their grandparents bought on a single income. By the 1970s and 80s, regulation stretched across every major sector: environmental mandates, worker rules, price caps, interest rate caps. The result was a maze only the biggest incumbents could navigate. This is regulatory capture, a system that protects the powerful by drowning newcomers in paperwork and compliance costs. It is a quiet form of tyranny, one measured not in violence but in opportunity denied. Economists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek issued warnings in clear, almost prophetic terms. When markets are shaped by regulation and monetary manipulation instead of competition, capitalism mutates into corporatism. Profits become the product of political access, not entrepreneurial excellence. Innovation slows, mobility freezes, society stratifies. The founders would not have called this industrial policy. They would have called it the beginning of a soft despotism. The genius of America was never the absence of failure. It was the right to fail and try again. A nation that allowed risk, stupidity, overconfidence, and ambition to collide in a marketplace that corrected excesses without political interference. People rose and fell by the strength of their ideas, not by the proximity of their lobbyists. But somewhere along the way, we decided safety mattered more than freedom. And safety, the illusion of it, has a cost. When people are shielded from loss, innovation withers. When institutions cannot fail, inefficiency calcifies. When government intervenes to prevent pain, it prevents learning. And the moment we surrendered the belief that freedom was worth its turbulence, the decline began. As China loosened its grip and allowed pockets of decentralization, it surged upward. As America tightened its grip and demanded stability, it slowed. Nations are governed by trade-offs, and we forgot ours. Since 1913, Americans have been told that a command economy, lightly disguised, could protect the little guy. But the result has been the opposite: a nation drifting into political polarization, cultural fracture, and forms of soft rebellion that feel eerily like the early stages of something more explosive. We are now living through a cold civil conflict states, battling the federal government, political violence simmering beneath the surface, trust in institutions collapsing. If we cannot agree on the rules of the game, we cannot play the game at all. And if we cannot choose a unified vision for what America must become, we will not survive the next chapter of global competition. Which brings us to the most dangerous question of all: what do we do now? Throughout the 19th century, the United States functioned with a simplicity that feels almost mythological today. Federal spending averaged less than 5% of gross domestic product, and most of that went toward defense, infrastructure, and the postal service, the connective tissue of a young republic. Yet under this minimal state, the American economy did not merely grow, It detonated. From 1820 to 1900, real GDP per capita tripled. In the span of 2 generations, a frontier society transformed into an industrial colossus. Between 1870 and 1913, America's share of global manufacturing output surged from roughly 23% to 32%, eclipsing even the vast British Empire. Real wages climbed 60% during that era, while prices fell or remained stable thanks to relentless innovation. That is what a free economy does. It makes things cheaper over time. Abundance is its natural byproduct. By 1900, the United States boasted the highest worker wages in the world. The rail network stretched 190,000 miles, built almost entirely by private capital, a continental nervous system constructed without federal micromanagement. Immigration exploded. 25 million people arrived between 1880 and 1913, the largest voluntary migration the world had ever seen. They came not for subsidies or entitlement programs, but for opportunity, the chance to gamble their future in a nation that rewarded courage and punished complacency. By 1950, with only 6% of the world's population, America generated roughly 27% of global GDP. The richest society in human history was not engineered by committees. It was unleashed by liberty. But as the 20th century unfolded, something subtle yet corrosive began to happen. As government spending expanded, regulation multiplied, and central banking hardened into orthodoxy, the dynamism that defined the American miracle began to flatten. Growth slowed, mobility stalled, innovation concentrated into fewer hands. The freer America once was, the faster it grew. The more Washington tried to manage the economy, the more the engine sputtered. This is not coincidence. It is gravity. So now we face a question that will define the next century. Do we attempt to outrun China by mimicking China? Or do we return to the principles that made America the most powerful economic engine ever built, a free market disciplined by risk, not politics? The answer is neither utopian nor safe. Every path carries danger, but one path carries far more danger than the others. First, we must rebuild our strategy from first principles. Economies obey patterns the way physics obeys laws. Every time humans run the same experiment, centralized planning, suppressed risk, engineered outcomes, the results converge. Efficiency in the short term, fragility in the long term. Collapse when dissent meets reality. Nothing comes for free. Everything is paid for by someone, somewhere. Economics is a cooperative and competitive game, simultaneously players aligned and opposed at every level of complexity. Cooperation is not a moral endpoint. It is a strategy to win. The government must serve as referee, not competitor. When it enters the arena as a player, the entire match becomes distorted. Signal becomes noise. Incentives warp. Markets cannot be predicted or controlled from the top down because no single mind, committee, or algorithm can understand the billions of decisions flowing through a modern economy. Decentralization is not a political preference. It is a survival tactic. Governments, by nature, drift toward control. Power expands unless restrained. So the rules must be transparent, fair, and ruthlessly enforced, especially against the rule makers themselves. The government's job is to secure property rights, enforce contracts, and maintain the rule of law, not to act as venture capitalist, industrial architect, or national CEO. The second pillar is infrastructure and innovation. The government will never be the birthplace of breakthrough ideas because it does not face competitive pressure. It does not feel fear. It does not face bankruptcy. Innovation grows in soil fertilized by danger, ambition, and the possibility of humiliation. So, the state should do what only the state can do. Lay the groundwork. Roads, power grids, communications networks, tax structures that reward risk-taking rather than punishing it. The state builds the arena. The private sector plays the game. Third, we must restore creative destruction. It sounds harsh, but the truth is honest. If no one can fail, no one can win. When unproductive enterprises are kept alive artificially, they clog the arteries of the economy. Capital is trapped. Talent is squandered. Market signals blur. You cannot prune a tree by protecting every dying branch. Sometimes a branch must fall so the rest can grow. Fourth, focus on national security and national dominance, not through authoritarian control, but through strategic clarity. Every country is playing a competitive game, whether it admits it or not. And the United States must play to win. That means rebuilding advanced manufacturing inside its borders. It means ending the catastrophic dependency on a geopolitical rival that now controls the majority of the minerals, components, and industrial processes that power our way of life. It means nurturing the world's largest middle class, because a strong economic core is the only real defense against both tyranny and decline. But inequality must remain a feature, not a flaw. Humans compete. They strive. No one trains for the Olympics hoping to finish in the middle. Wealth gaps become dangerous only when they calcify, when mobility freezes, when the game becomes rigged. Free markets allow ascent. Rigged systems prevent it. Fifth, when government intervention is truly unavoidable, and there will be moments it must be narrow, temporary, transparent, and structurally constrained. If Washington needs to secure semiconductor production or critical minerals for national security, fine. But that must happen through a single, specialized fund, a strategic capital facility with clear rules, independent oversight, and mandatory expiration dates. Minority stakes only. No political meddling. Equal terms with private investors. Automatic exit within years, not decades. Taxpayer upside, not taxpayer bailouts. And above all, a guarantee that such intervention is the exception, not the new operating system of America. Sixth, unclog the arteries of the real economy. Regulations must expire unless renewed. Monopolies must be dismantled wherever they suffocate competition. Data must be portable so consumers can switch services easily, forcing companies to innovate instead of entrench. The market must be allowed to breathe again. Seventh, and this is the cornerstone, strict fiscal and monetary guardrails. Without discipline, nothing else matters. Balance the budget. Cap deficits to the growth rate of the economy except in genuine wartime. Restore trust in the currency. Because if money becomes fiction, society becomes fiction with it. Put all of these elements together, and the path forward becomes clear. Not easy, but clear. America does not need a 5-year plan. It needs a 5-point compass. Freedom, competition, sound money, limited regulation, and a government that knows how to leave when the job is done. This is how we stop our managed decline. This is how we transform the next century into a chapter of progress, not authoritarian drift. And this is how we avoid the most fatal mistake a free nation can make, attempting to out-China China instead of out-America the world. But none of these principles matter unless we understand the final truth, the truth that determines whether the engine of innovation keeps roaring or sputters into quiet obedience. Freedom is messy. It is slow, wasteful, unpredictable, and often infuriating. It tolerates stupidity, rewards risk, and allows people to chase delusions that sometimes end in brilliance and sometimes in bankruptcy. But this chaos, this swirling marketplace of imperfect humans making imperfect decisions, is the very furnace of innovation. It is what allowed a nation with 4% of the world's population to create nearly half of the world's billion-dollar companies. It is why the microchip, the internet, reusable rockets, and electric cars were born not from committees or ministries, but from dreamers and dissenters who refused to ask for permission. China's system can sprint. That is its advantage. But the free market can self-correct, and that is its superpower. When you strip away the romantic language, the real question becomes painfully simple. Do we want a future run by bureaucrats or by builders? Because when the state uses its authority like a scalpel, when it intervenes narrowly, lightly, and temporarily, extraordinary things can happen. But when it swings that authority like a sledgehammer, people learn to stay quiet. They wait for instructions. They adapt not to opportunity, but to caution. They hold out their hands for permission and subsidies instead of reaching for greatness. And an economy built on fear will always underperform an economy built on freedom. This is the crossroads America stands at now. If we want to remain the world's innovation engine, we cannot drift any further into the gravity of centralized control. We must reclaim the forces that made us exceptional: decentralization, competition, risk, and individual sovereignty. Freedom is noisy, but tyranny is silent. A command economy promises stability, predictability, and safety until the day it does not. The same structure that allows it to move mountains also ensures that when mistakes happen, they destroy everything beneath them. One bad leader, one bad policy, one bad decade, and the damage becomes irreversible. Bottom-up systems, messy, argumentative, inefficient, avoid catastrophe by distributing decision-making across millions of minds. They generate redundancy, options, alternatives. They allow reality to speak through prices, failures, and feedback loops. This decentralization is not a defect. It is the shield that protects societies from collapse. That is why America's task is not to mimic China's authoritarian efficiency, but to sharpen its own competitive edge. We must out-innovate, not out-mandate. Out-build, not out-control. Out-compete, not out-centralize. And yes, this comes with suffering. Markets crash, companies die, fortunes evaporate. But this cycle, rise, fall, rebuild, is the pulse of progress. Failure is not a wound. It is a clearing. It is what allows new giants to emerge. If we smother that process under the weight of political management, we will engineer our own stagnation, not with violence, but with comfort. Not with oppression, but with protection. Not with chains, but with cushions. The truth is simple. A society that protects everyone from failure eventually protects itself from success. To unlock the next century of prosperity, we must rediscover the courage to let people fail, to let ideas collide, to let markets speak louder than mandates, to accept that inequality will always exist, but mobility must always remain possible, to believe that the pursuit of greatness matters more than the fear of risk. That is how America once rewrote the story of human potential, by trusting individuals more than institutions. When we stray from that trust, we begin the slow drift into a world ruled not by entrepreneurs but by administrators, not by creativity but by compliance, not by rebels but by caretakers. And caretakers do not build engines that reshape the world. It is not enough to avoid authoritarianism. We must actively cultivate its opposite. We must choose systems that reward ingenuity rather than obedience. We must build environments where the next generation of inventors feels the freedom to attempt something absurd. Because every breakthrough begins life as an absurd idea until time proves it inevitable. The question before us is not theoretical, it is urgent. If we continue sliding toward state-directed capitalism, we may well win a few short-term battles against China, but we will lose the long-term war against ourselves. We will sacrifice the very mechanism that made us the global beacon of innovation in the first place. And history is merciless to nations that forget what made them exceptional. We do not need a centrally dictated vision of the future. We need a compass that points us toward enduring principles: freedom, competition, sound money, limited regulation, and a government that remembers how to walk away. This is how we out-America every rival. This is how we turn the next 100 years into a century of progress rather than a century of control. And this is how we honor the gift handed to us by the restless, imperfect, brilliant builders who came before. In the end, the choice is stark: a future managed by bureaucrats or a future created by builders. A nation that chases safety or a nation that chases greatness. A people who wait for permission or a people who dare to breathe free. Whichever path we choose now will decide whether the United States remains the world's engine of innovation, or becomes just another chapter in the long, tragic history of nations that surrendered freedom for the illusion of control. The world is watching, the future is forming, and the clock is already running